There is a kind of tiredness that doesn't show on the face. A quiet, bruised heaviness carried by people who learned too much, too early. They adapted faster than their hearts could follow. They became responsible before they felt ready. They grew into versions of themselves they never had time to understand. And so they move through the world with a subtle ache. Not from failure, but from expansion. Not from weakness, but from surviving chapters that demanded too much, too soon. This is the documentary of that hidden weariness, the soft exhaustion of outgrowing your past before you had the chance to be young in it. A story of inner stretching, silent resilience, and the loneliness of becoming more than you once were. It never arrives with drama, no collapse, no breaking point, just a subtle awareness, like a quiet draft slipping through a closed room. A sense that something inside has been tired for longer than anyone realized. For people who outgrew themselves too quickly, the first recognition of weariness is often gentle, almost unremarkable. It might show up in a forgotten laugh, a smile that doesn't reach the eyes the way it used to, a sudden stillness during a moment that should have felt light. They move through their routines with practiced competence, yet a faint distance follows them, as if they're watching their own life from a few steps behind. There is no single moment that announces you are exhausted. Instead, it's a slow pattern forming beneath the surface. They notice how celebrations feel muted, as though joy has to travel a longer path to reach them. They notice how conversations feel heavier, even when nothing difficult is said. They notice how rest never feels complete, not because of lack of sleep, but because the body and the mind are waking from different stories. Some describe it as a heaviness behind the ribs, others a thin film between them and the present moment. But the experience is the same, the quiet fracture between what they show and what they feel. This weariness is not dramatic. It's not even easily visible. It lives in the pauses between sentences, in the breath held before answering a harmless question, in the way they sometimes stare at an object without remembering what they were reaching for. People around them say, "You're so strong. You always handle everything. You're amazing." And these words land with a strange weight. Compliments that once felt affirming now carry the pressure of maintenance, as if strength has become a role rather than a truth. Often they grow aware of their exhaustion, not because of an event, but because the world slows down for a brief moment. A quiet evening at home, a long train ride, a walk in an empty street, and the mind finally has space to whisper what it's been holding back. Sometimes, the realization appears as a simple thought. Why do I feel older than my life? Or, when did everything become a responsibility? Or even, why does rest feel like something I haven't earned? These are not dramatic questions. They are the soft beginnings of self-recognition. Because people who outgrew themselves too quickly often develop an instinct to minimize their own needs. They are used to being the anchor, the stable one, the one who understands, adapts, absorbs. Their emotional muscles have been flexed for years without pause, and in the quiet, the truth surfaces. Growth came at a cost, and the body remembers what the mind tried to outrun. The moment they noticed is rarely spoken aloud. They don't announce it. They don't confide immediately. Even to themselves, the acknowledgement feels tentative. It's not sadness, not depression, not burnout in the traditional sense. It is a kind of spiritual fatigue, a deep exhale that never finishes, a weariness born from being capable for too long. Yet beneath this recognition lies something important. Awareness is the first soft crack in the armor. Not a break, but a widening, a small, tender permission to feel what has long been pushed aside. In this chapter of their inner story, the noticing is quiet but transformative, because once someone becomes aware of the hidden weariness, the world doesn't look the same. Conversations feel different, responsibilities feel heavier, moments of rest feel unfamiliar. They begin to sense the emotional weight they've been carrying, not as a temporary burden, but as a long-term companion. And without choosing it, they take their first step back into themselves. A hesitant return, a gentle realization, not of weakness, but of humanity. That even the strongest hearts grow tired when they outgrow themselves before they learn how to rest. It often starts quietly, not with a dramatic moment, but with an atmosphere, a home that needed more from them than it should, a childhood that asked for steadiness instead of exploration, or a life event that rearranged time, forcing someone to become older overnight. People who outgrew themselves too quickly rarely choose that path. Growth comes as a response to something, an unspoken expectation, a shifting family dynamic, a sudden loss, a responsibility handed to them before their hands were ready. Some grew up in households where emotions were too loud or too absent, where parents leaned on their child, or siblings looked to them for direction, or silence filled the rooms with tasks no one named but everyone felt. In these environments, childhood becomes a negotiation. What part of yourself must you put aside so things don't fall apart? They learn to sense tension before it's spoken. They learn to stabilize conversations that should never have been theirs to manage. They become good at reading emotions, anticipating needs, soothing storms, skills that look impressive in adulthood, but were born from necessity, not choice. Others experienced abrupt change. Move, a separation, an illness, a betrayal that fractured their understanding of safety. In these moments, time compresses. Someone who was once carefree becomes alert, responsible, cautious. They don't grow fast for achievement. They grow fast to survive. There are those who are praised for independence too early, who are called mature for their age, before they had the chance to understand what maturity actually feels like. Praise becomes a kind of currency. Be helpful, be understanding, be strong, and love will continue. So they comply, not because they want to, but because it seems like the surest way to belong. In the process, childhood becomes slippery. It dissolves. They no longer remember how to ask for help. They no longer remember what carefree feels like. Their inner world becomes shaped by roles, not desires. The environment teaches them that vulnerability is a luxury, and that needing less makes life easier for everyone. So they learn to compress themselves, to tighten their emotional space, to outrun their own feelings, not out of recklessness, but out of duty. This early acceleration forms a template, a belief that they must always be ahead of themselves, ahead of problems, ahead of emotions, ahead of the moment. They become people who anticipate more than they experience, people who prepare more than they rest. And because the world rewards this kind of adaptation, their growth begins to look like success, not sacrifice. Yet the origins remain, the quiet moments where they were taught to shrink what hurt and expand what was useful. In adulthood, they may not remember every detail, but they remember the feeling that life required them to be composed too soon. This chapter of their story isn't about blame. It's about context. It's about understanding the soil from which their maturity grew. Because growth without guidance stretches a person in ways their emotions can't always follow. The hidden weariness found its beginnings here, in the quiet pressure to be more than a child, more than a teenager, more than a single human heart could reasonably carry. And though they eventually learned to thrive, there is still a part of them rooted in those early days, holding the weight of everything they learned too soon. For the person who outgrew themselves too quickly, the past is not a place of regret. It is a place of origins, a place where the seeds of emotional endurance were planted long before they understood the cost. Psychology has a quiet term for this experience: developmental acceleration, when external circumstances push emotional, cognitive, or social growth ahead of its natural pace. But underneath the clinical phrasing lives a deeply human truth. The mind expands faster than the heart can follow. People who grow up too fast often experience what psychologists call identity dilation. Their sense of self stretches wide, capable, perceptive, responsible. But the inner emotional development lags behind, like a child walking to catch a train already in motion. This mismatch creates an invisible tension. On the outside, they look composed. On the inside, their emotional world is still arranging itself, trying to match the roles they've been forced to inhabit. Another concept emerges here: emotional compression. When a child or young adult doesn't have space or safety to process feelings, the mind folds them tightly into unexamined corners. These compressed emotions don't disappear, they simply wait. And as life continues, more layers form, resulting in a person who carries emotional weight they don't consciously recognize. Neuroscience adds another dimension. The brain's stress response systems, particularly the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, develop under pressure. When someone grows up learning to manage crises, their brain becomes efficient at survival, but less fluent in rest. Rest feels foreign. Safety feels unfamiliar. Calmness feels earned rather than natural. This creates a state known as chronic hypervigilance. The nervous system stays alert, ready to adjust, respond, accommodate. Even without danger, the body remembers the past and keeps its guard raised just in case. But the most striking psychological pattern is something subtler: role-based selfhood. A person becomes defined by what they provide: the listener, the responsible one, the peacemaker, the dependable presence. Their identity grows around usefulness, and over time, they lose access to parts of themselves that don't serve that role. This is why, in adulthood, they may feel inexplicably empty or detached, not because they lack purpose, but because they've never had the chance to grow as themselves, only as what was needed. The mind adapts, but the heart lingers, still young in places, still carrying unprocessed fears, still longing for a chapter that never arrived. This emotional lag creates the hidden weariness, the exhaustion of constantly appearing older than you feel, more grounded than you are, more stable than your heart has been allowed to be. Psychology calls this emotional incongruence, a misalignment between the internal age and the external persona. But humans call it something simpler: a quiet loneliness within themselves. Even achievement doesn't soothe it. Even stability doesn't erase it, because their growth was shaped by survival, not curiosity. Yet this understanding brings something gentle, a realization that nothing is wrong with them, that the weariness they feel is not weakness, but evidence of how much they've carried. The science explains the mechanics, but the truth is deeply personal. Outgrowing yourself too quickly creates emotional debt, a backlog of feelings waiting to be acknowledged, a self waiting to be met. This chapter isn't about pathology. It's about naming what was long unnamed. Psychological architecture behind a life lived ahead of schedule. The quietly complex experience of being more capable than prepared, more evolved than emotionally supported. To understand this weariness is to see its humanity. To recognize that every swift growth has a shadow, and every strong exterior carries a story the heart is still trying to tell. There comes a point when a person begins to notice two versions of themselves living side by side. The outer self is practiced, composed, competent in a way that impresses others and embarrasses the inner child who still lives behind the ribs. The inner self is quieter, softer, still trying to make sense of the years it skipped. This is the inner split, a separation between the self that grew out of necessity and the self that never had the chance to fully form. It begins subtly, a sense of feeling disconnected from one's own achievements, a discomfort when people praise their maturity, a private confusion about why they feel so young inside despite being so capable on the outside. The inner self still longs for things the outer self considers impractical: rest, dependence, gentleness, permission to not know, permission to be held. Simple human needs that were once postponed and eventually forgotten. But the conflict doesn't appear as longing. It appears as guilt. They feel guilty for wanting softness when they've been admired for strength. Guilty for needing help when they've built a life around being the helper. Guilty for slowing down when speed once kept them safe. This guilt forms a barrier between the two selves, a belief that the mature identity must be protected at all costs. But the cost is emotional disconnection, a feeling of being perpetually misaligned. The outer self speaks in responsibilities. The inner self speaks in feelings. They rarely listen to each other. This split is not a failure of character. It is a psychological adaptation, a protective strategy developed during times when vulnerability was dangerous or inconvenient. But as life stabilizes, the split becomes more noticeable. The outer self grows tired of holding everything. The inner self grows tired of being ignored. And so the conflict begins. There are days when the outer self leads, efficient, composed, reliable. There are days when the inner self pushes through. Sudden sadness, inexplicable fatigue, a quiet yearning for a life untouched by responsibility. Most people experiencing this don't realize it's an internal reunion trying to happen. They just feel confused, fragmented, strange. They might say, "I feel like I'm two people," or "I don't feel connected to who I've become," or "I feel older and younger at the same time." These are not signs of dysfunction. They are signs of a life lived at two speeds, the pace of survival and the pace of emotion. When someone grows too quickly, the outer self rushes ahead. But this inner self walks slowly, collecting the moments that were skipped. Eventually, the distance becomes too wide to ignore. This chapter of their life isn't dramatic. It's tender. It's the slow recognition that their heart still holds the age at which it learned to be strong, and their spirit still carries the questions they never had time to ask. The hidden weariness grows here, from trying to keep both selves afloat without letting them meet. But beneath the conflict is something quiet and hopeful. The awareness that the inner child has waited patiently, not to take over, but to return home. Turning points are often imagined as sudden, dramatic moments. A breaking, a revelation, a rush of clarity. But for those who outgrew themselves too quickly, realization arrives gently, so quietly that it almost gets missed. It can happen while washing dishes, or during a late-night walk, or in the silence after a difficult conversation. A moment where the world pauses just long enough for truth to surface. They don't think, "I need to change." They think, "I'm tired in a way rest doesn't fix." And that thought becomes the beginning. This slow realization feels like a soft ache. Not painful, just honest. A feeling that the body and mind have been carrying each other for too long. There might be a moment when they look at themselves, in a mirror, in a memory, in a passing reflection, and feel a distance they can no longer ignore. The outer self stands tall, but the inner self whispers, "I've been waiting." Realization isn't a decision. It's an acknowledgement. A recognition that their strength has been overused, that their independence has turned into isolation, that their maturity has grown heavy with unprocessed years. In this moment, a quiet grief appears, not for anything lost, but for everything postponed. The childhood softness, the simplicity, the innocence of not knowing, the right to rest without justification. This grief is not dramatic, it's gentle, a softness pressing against the edges of strength. For the first time, they begin to understand the price of their endurance, not with blame, but with compassion, not with regret, but with clarity. And slowly, something shifts. They begin noticing the small ways they abandon themselves, the way they take care of others before acknowledging their own exhaustion, the way they fill silence with usefulness, the way they avoid resting because rest feels like losing control. This noticing is the turning point. It is the moment the mind says, "You cannot keep running forward without bringing your heart with you." There is no fanfare, no external change. The world looks the same. But internally, a door opens, a willingness to see the self that has been waiting behind years of composure. Some describe it as a soft surrender, a quiet exhale, a permission to stop pretending they are endlessly capable. Others describe it as a moment of stillness, where they finally feel themselves without the armor, and instead of collapsing, they feel relief. This is the shift that begins healing, not the desire to become someone new, but the desire to meet the version of themselves they left behind. The slow realization is not about fixing anything. It's about recognizing the tenderness beneath strength, the humanity beneath survival, the longing beneath responsibility. It marks the beginning of returning home to oneself. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet care that they once reserved only for others. Healing for someone who outgrew themselves too quickly is not a transformation. It is a reunion. It begins with small permissions: to feel tired without apology, to rest without justification, to exist without being useful. At first, these permissions feel foreign, almost wrong. The outer self resists, still convinced that slowing down means losing control. But the inner self welcomes the space. It has waited patiently, holding the emotions that were delayed, the softness that was postponed, the parts of the self that were placed on pause. Making space for the self does not look like dramatic breakthroughs. It looks like noticing, pausing, being honest with oneself in small, quiet moments. It might sound like, "I don't actually want to do this right now," or "This responsibility doesn't belong to me," or "I need gentleness today." These are not demands, they are acknowledgements, and each one creates room for the self to step closer. The outer self, shaped by years of necessity, learned something surprising. The world doesn't collapse when they soften. People do not crumble when they rest. Life continues, and for the first time, they get to continue with it, rather than ahead of it. Integration happens in layers. The strong, capable self and the quiet, vulnerable self begin to meet. Not in conflict, but in conversation. The inner self brings emotion. The outer self brings safety. Together they build a life where both can exist. The nervous system slowly recalibrates. Hypervigilance begins to ease. Moments of rest feel less dangerous. Stillness becomes something they can trust, not something to brace against. This is not regression. It is expansion. It is allowing the parts of themselves that were once suppressed to finally have a voice. They begin to understand that maturity is not about abandoning their younger self. It is about bringing that self forward, letting it grow at the pace it was once denied. Making space for the self also means acknowledging the exhaustion without minimizing it. Saying, "Of course I'm tired. Of course this feels heavy. I carried too much for too long." This honesty is healing. It releases the pressure to constantly perform strength. It invites vulnerability without fear. Slowly, they learn to meet their own needs with the same tenderness they once offered others. Not as compensation, but as balance. The hidden weariness begins to lift. Not because life becomes easier, but because they stop carrying it alone. The outer self learns to rest. The inner self learns to trust. And together, they form something whole. A self that is no longer split between survival and longing. Healing is not a destination. It is a soft alignment. A feeling of finally living at the right pace. A pace that matches the quiet rhythm of the heart. When a person who outgrew themselves too quickly finally slows down, their life doesn't suddenly transform. There are no dramatic endings or cinematic revelations. Just a quiet, steady shift. The world looks the same, but it feels different. The hidden weariness that once lived beneath every step begins to soften. Not disappear, just soften, like tension finally exhaling. They move through life more gently. Not because they've become weaker, but because they no longer force themselves to be unbreakable. The aftermath of growth is subtle. They smile more easily, not the polite smile of capability, but the warmer one that comes from presence. They rest more honestly, not collapsing from exhaustion, but choosing to slow down because they deserve to. Relationships shift too, not dramatically, but naturally. People around them sense the difference, the opening, the softness, the quiet return of selfhood. They no longer carry every conversation. They no longer hide fatigue behind competence. They allow silences. They allow imperfection. They allow themselves. And in these small allowances, a deeper form of maturity emerges, one rooted not in survival, but in self-connection. The past doesn't disappear. It sits with them, but no longer leads. It becomes a quiet witness rather than a dictator. The child within them, once frozen in time, begins to grow again, slowly, gently, finally allowed to catch up. This inner reunion brings a new kind of peace, a peace not born from having everything figured out, but from accepting that they don't need to. The aftermath of growth is not about triumph, it's about tenderness. The tenderness of knowing how strong you had to be and choosing softness anyway. It's about understanding that outgrowing yourself is not a flaw. It is a story of adaptation, endurance, and survival. But it is also a story of return. A return to the self that waited quietly beneath the layers of responsibility. A self that was never lost, just postponed. In this final chapter, what remains is not weariness, but depth. Not regret, but clarity. Not emptiness, but space. A spaciousness inside the heart, where all versions of the self can finally breathe together. The person who once grew too quickly now grows deliberately, slowly, at a pace that honors both who they were and who they are becoming. And in this quiet aftermath, there is a simple truth. You are allowed to be whole. You are allowed to move gently. You are allowed to exist without rushing, because the journey was never about becoming stronger. It was about learning that strength was never the whole story. The hidden weariness softens into wisdom. The past shifts into perspective. And the self, long divided, becomes one again. A quiet ending, a soft beginning, a life finally lived at its real speed.